I never thought I'd be standing in Congress trying to explain to my colleagues why a 31-year-old conservative activist was shot dead while speaking to college students, or why a 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee who survived a war only to be murdered on public transportation in Charlotte. But after months of investigating these tragedies and dozens of others like them, I've uncovered a disturbing reality that goes far deeper than individual acts of violence. What I've discovered about America's violence and safety breakdown isn't just shocking. It's a systematic failure that touches every community, every family, and every person who believes they should be safe in their own country. The morning I received the briefing about Charlie Kirk's assassination at Utah Valley University, I thought I was looking at an isolated incident. A young conservative activist, father of two, gunned down by a sniper while addressing students about political engagement. The initial reports focused on the political divide, the heated rhetoric, the 22-year-old shooter who'd positioned himself on a rooftop to kill someone whose views he disagreed with. But as I dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding that September 10th attack, I realized we weren't dealing with a lone wolf or a simple case of political extremism. 3 weeks later, when Irina Zarutska was stabbed to death on the Charlotte light rail system by a repeat violent offender, I started seeing the pattern that law enforcement and politicians have been desperately trying to hide from the American people. These weren't random acts of violence. These weren't isolated incidents of political hatred or street crime. These were symptoms of a comprehensive breakdown in the systems that are supposed to protect American citizens. And the failure goes much deeper than anyone wants to admit. The Charlie Kirk assassination wasn't just about political polarization, though that was certainly a factor. When I reviewed the security protocols for that event, I discovered that despite clear threats against Kirk's life, despite intelligence indicating potential violence, despite the fact that he was speaking to 3,000 people in an open venue, the security arrangements were completely inadequate. Local law enforcement had been notified about general threats, but there was no coordination between agencies, no comprehensive security plan, no systematic approach to protecting someone who was clearly a target. But here's what really shocked me when I investigated further. The building where Tyler James Robinson positioned himself to take the shot, it should have been secured. The sight lines from that rooftop to the speaking platform were obvious to anyone who understood basic security principles. The failure to secure that position wasn't an oversight. It was negligence that cost a young father his life and traumatized thousands of students who witnessed a political assassination on their campus. The broader context makes this even more disturbing. Charlie Kirk had been receiving death threats for months. His organization, Turning Point USA, had documented dozens of incidents where their speakers were threatened, harassed, or physically attacked on college campuses. But when they requested enhanced security assistance from federal agencies, they were told that threats against conservative speakers didn't qualify for the same level of protection provided to other political figures. Think about that for a moment. We live in a country where threats against certain political voices are taken seriously and responded to with comprehensive security measures, while threats against other voices are essentially ignored until someone gets killed. That's not equal protection under the law. That's political discrimination that creates an environment where assassination becomes predictable rather than preventable. The Irina Zarutska murder in Charlotte reveals another dimension of our safety breakdown that's equally disturbing, but affects ordinary citizens rather than public figures. This young woman survived the Russian invasion of Ukraine, fled her homeland, came to America seeking safety and opportunity, only to be randomly stabbed to death by DeCarlos Brown Jr., a man with an extensive history of violent crimes who should never have been free to attack anyone. When I examined Brown's criminal record, I found a pattern that repeats itself in cities across America. Multiple arrests for violent offenses, multiple releases without adequate supervision, multiple opportunities for intervention that were missed or ignored. The man who killed Irina Zarutska had been in and out of the criminal justice system for years, but the system consistently failed to protect the public from someone who was clearly dangerous. But the failure goes beyond just inadequate criminal justice policies. The Charlotte light rail system where Zarutska was murdered has been the site of numerous violent incidents over the past several years. Transit authorities have documented increasing problems with safety and security, but instead of addressing the underlying issues, they've focused on managing public perception and minimizing negative publicity. I've reviewed incident reports that show a clear pattern of escalating violence on public transportation systems across the country. Assaults, robberies, sexual attacks, and now murder have become routine occurrences that transit authorities treat as acceptable costs of doing business rather than crises that demand immediate action. Meanwhile, working families who depend on public transportation are forced to risk their safety every day because they can't afford other options. The connection between these two tragedies and hundreds of others like them becomes clear when you understand how our approach to public safety has been systematically degraded over the past decade. Instead of focusing on preventing violence and protecting citizens, law enforcement and security agencies have become reactive forces that primarily document crimes after they occur, rather than preventing them from happening in the first place. Political violence in particular has been allowed to escalate because there's no systematic approach to identifying and neutralizing threats before they turn deadly. The same agencies that can track down tax evaders and investigate financial crimes somehow can't prevent assassinations when the threats are made publicly on social media platforms that are monitored 24/7 by intelligence agencies. The Charlie Kirk assassination could have been prevented if we had competent threat assessment and response protocols. The shooter didn't hide his intentions. He didn't operate in secret. He made statements on social media that clearly indicated his intent to commit violence. But despite all our surveillance technology and intelligence capabilities, despite billions of dollars spent on Homeland Security, a 22-year-old college student was able to plan and execute a political assassination that anyone paying attention could have seen coming. This isn't just about failed intelligence or inadequate security measures. It's about a deliberate choice to allow certain types of violence to continue, because stopping them would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the political environment that our leaders have created and fostered. The normalization of political violence didn't happen overnight. It's been building for years through rhetoric that dehumanizes political opponents, through media coverage that sensationalizes conflict rather than promoting dialogue, through social media algorithms that reward extreme statements and inflammatory content. But most importantly, it's been enabled by the failure of law enforcement and political leaders to treat threats of political violence with the seriousness they deserve. When protesters show up at the homes of Supreme Court justices with the clear intent to intimidate, when members of Congress receive death threats that are investigated perfunctorily, if at all, when political rallies become targets for violence that everyone can see coming but no one seems able to prevent, we've created an environment where assassination becomes not just possible but inevitable. The random violence that killed Irina Zarutska represents a different but equally serious breakdown in public safety systems. This wasn't political violence, but it was preventable violence that occurred because we've abandoned the basic principle that government exists to protect citizens from predators who would harm them. DeCarlos Brown Jr. wasn't a mystery to law enforcement. He wasn't someone who suddenly snapped or whose violent tendencies were unknown. He was a repeat offender whose pattern of escalating violence was well documented, but who was repeatedly released back into the community because our criminal justice system has prioritized everything except public safety. The policies that allowed Brown to be free to murder Zarutska are the same policies that have led to skyrocketing violence in cities across America, bail reform measures that release violent criminals without adequate supervision, sentencing guidelines that prioritize rehabilitation over public protection, parole systems that operate on the assumption that violent criminals can be successfully reintegrated into society without proper monitoring or support. I'm not against rehabilitation or criminal justice reform, but when reform policies consistently result in violent criminals being released to commit more violence, those policies are failures that cost innocent lives. And when policymakers refuse to acknowledge these failures because they conflict with ideological commitments, they become complicit in the violence that results. The broader context of urban violence reveals how comprehensive our safety breakdown has become. In cities across America, violent crime rates have increased dramatically over the past several years, but the response from political leaders has been to downplay the statistics, change the reporting methods, or blame external factors rather than address the policy failures that are directly responsible for the increase in violence. Public transportation systems, which should be safe spaces for working families and vulnerable populations, have become hunting grounds for predators who know that their chances of being caught and held accountable are minimal. Schools, which should be sanctuaries for children, require metal detectors and armed guards because we can't guarantee basic safety in educational environments. Shopping centers, restaurants, entertainment venues, and even churches have become potential targets for violence because we've created a society where violent individuals face few consequences for their actions, while law-abiding citizens are left to fend for themselves. This isn't the result of an inevitable increase in human evil or some unchangeable aspect of modern society. This is the predictable result of policy choices that prioritize the rights of criminals over the safety of victims. The mental health crisis adds another layer of complexity to our violence problem, but it's been used more often as an excuse for inaction than as a framework for effective intervention. Both the Charlie Kirk assassination and the Zarutska murder involved perpetrators who likely had mental health issues that went untreated, but focusing only on mental health misses the broader policy failures that enabled these tragedies. Mental health treatment is certainly important, but it's not a substitute for effective law enforcement, competent security protocols, or criminal justice policies that prioritize public safety. Most people with mental health issues are not violent, and most violence is not committed by people with diagnosed mental illness. Using mental health as an explanation for violence often serves to avoid addressing the systematic failures that make violence more likely and less preventable. The technology aspect of modern violence reveals another dimension of our safety breakdown. Social media platforms have become recruitment tools for violent extremists, planning spaces for criminal activity, and distribution networks for content that promotes and glorifies violence. But instead of regulating these platforms to reduce their contribution to violence, we've allowed them to operate with minimal oversight while they profit from engagement-driven algorithms that reward the most inflammatory and dangerous content. The Charlie Kirk assassination was planned and promoted on social media platforms that have sophisticated monitoring capabilities but chose not to intervene until after the violence occurred. The same platforms that can immediately identify and remove copyright violations somehow can't detect and prevent content that promotes political assassination. This isn't a technical limitation, it's a choice. These companies have the technology to monitor and regulate content in real time, but they've chosen to prioritize profits over public safety. And political leaders have allowed them to make this choice without consequences because many of those leaders benefit from the political polarization that these platforms create and amplify. The international dimension of our violence crisis adds another troubling element to consider. Irina Zarutska came to America fleeing violence in Ukraine, seeking the safety and opportunity that America has traditionally represented to people around the world. Her murder on American public transportation represents not just a personal tragedy, but a failure of the promise that America offers to those seeking refuge from violence and oppression. How can we maintain our moral authority in international affairs when we can't protect refugees from violence on our own streets? How can we criticize other countries for failing to protect their citizens when we're failing to protect people who've come to us for safety? The answer is that we can't. And the world is noticing our failures even when we refuse to acknowledge them ourselves. The economic impact of our violence crisis extends far beyond the immediate costs of criminal investigations, medical treatment, and incarceration. Businesses avoid investing in communities where violence is common. Families move away from areas where they don't feel safe. Property values decline when violence increases. Economic opportunities disappear when people are afraid to participate in normal commercial and social activities. The long-term economic costs of our safety breakdown are enormous, but they're rarely included in discussions about criminal justice policy or public safety spending. Politicians focus on the immediate costs of law enforcement and corrections while ignoring the much larger costs of lost economic activity, reduced property values, and diminished quality of life that result from inadequate public safety. Educational institutions face particular challenges in our current violence environment. The assassination of Charlie Kirk on a university campus represents an escalation in campus violence that threatens the basic function of higher education. Universities are supposed to be places where different ideas can be discussed and debated, but when political violence becomes a real possibility, free expression becomes impossible. Students who witnessed the Kirk assassination will carry that trauma with them for the rest of their lives. Faculty and administrators at universities across the country now have to consider the possibility of political violence when planning events and speakers. The chilling effect on academic freedom and open dialogue is immeasurable, but it's a direct result of our failure to prevent predictable violence. K-12 schools face similar challenges as violence spreads throughout society. Children who should be focused on learning instead practice lockdown drills and worry about their safety in classrooms. Teachers who should be educating students instead spend time planning for potential violent incidents. Resources that should go to educational programs instead get diverted to security measures and crisis response preparations. The healthcare system bears enormous costs from our violence crisis, both in terms of treating victims and dealing with the broader public health implications of living in a violent society. Emergency rooms in cities across America have become trauma centers that deal primarily with violence-related injuries rather than traditional medical emergencies. Healthcare workers face increasing risks of violence in their workplaces, while the stress and trauma of treating violence victims takes a toll on their mental health and professional effectiveness. The ripple effects of violence extend far beyond the immediate victims to affect everyone involved in responding to and treating the consequences of violent acts. The political response to our violence crisis has been characterized more by denial and misdirection than by serious efforts to address underlying causes. Politicians on both sides of the aisle have found it easier to blame their opponents for violence than to acknowledge the policy failures that have created an environment where violence thrives. Conservative politicians tend to focus on criminal justice policies while ignoring the economic and social factors that contribute to violence. Liberal politicians tend to focus on economic and social factors while ignoring the need for effective law enforcement and criminal accountability. Neither approach addresses the full scope of the problem, and the result is continued violence while politicians score political points rather than solving problems. The media coverage of violence has become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Sensationalized reporting that focuses on the most dramatic aspects of violent incidents while ignoring underlying causes and potential solutions creates a climate of fear and helplessness that makes productive policy discussions more difficult. The 24-hour news cycle demands constant content, and violence provides compelling stories that generate high ratings and social media engagement. But this coverage often glorifies perpetrators, traumatizes viewers, and creates copycat effects that lead to more violence. The media has a responsibility to inform the public, but current coverage patterns often make the violence problem worse rather than better. Social media has amplified these problems by creating echo chambers where people are exposed only to information that confirms their existing beliefs and fears. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement reward the most inflammatory content, creating incentives for users to post increasingly extreme and violent content to gain attention and followers. The democratization of information distribution through social media platforms has some benefits, but it has also created an environment where false information, conspiracy theories, and calls for violence can spread rapidly without oversight or fact-checking. The result is a more polarized and fearful society that is more prone to violence and less capable of constructive dialogue. Law enforcement agencies face significant challenges in our current environment, but many of these challenges are the result of policy choices and institutional failures rather than unavoidable circumstances. Police departments that have focused on community policing and crime prevention have generally been more successful at reducing violence than departments that have focused primarily on arrests and prosecutions after crimes occur. But effective community policing requires resources, training, and long-term commitment from political leaders who are often more interested in short-term political gains than in building sustainable public safety programs. The result is that many communities lack the proactive law enforcement presence that could prevent violence before it occurs. Federal law enforcement agencies have enormous resources and sophisticated capabilities, but they often focus on high-profile cases that generate positive publicity rather than systematic efforts to reduce violence at the community level. The assassination of Charlie Kirk and the murder of Irina Zarutska both involve federal investigations, but federal agencies could have prevented these crimes if they had been properly monitoring and responding to threats, rather than simply investigating after the fact. Intelligence agencies have access to vast amounts of information about potential threats, but this information is often not shared effectively with local law enforcement agencies that are responsible for preventing violence in their communities. The result is that warning signs are often visible to federal agencies, but don't reach the people who could act on them to prevent violence. The international intelligence community shares information about terrorist threats and international criminal activities, but domestic violence often doesn't receive the same level of attention and resources, even when it poses equal or greater risks to public safety. This disparity in focus and resources contributes to our inability to prevent domestic violence while spending enormous amounts on international security threats. Private security companies have grown rapidly as public safety has deteriorated, but private security primarily serves wealthy individuals and communities rather than providing broad public protection. This creates a two-tiered system where people who can afford private security get protection while everyone else faces increasing risks from violence. The growth of private security also represents a failure of public institutions to provide basic safety services that should be available to all citizens, regardless of their economic status. When wealthy people feel the need to hire private security because they don't trust public law enforcement to protect them, that's a sign of fundamental institutional failure. Corporate security measures have increased dramatically in response to rising violence, but these measures often simply displace violence rather than preventing it. Shopping malls, office buildings, and entertainment venues may become safer through enhanced security, but the underlying sources of violence remain unaddressed and often move to softer targets where security is less comprehensive. The technology industry has developed sophisticated surveillance and monitoring systems that could be used to prevent violence, but these systems are often deployed in ways that prioritize corporate profits or political control rather than public safety. Facial recognition systems, predictive analytics, and communications monitoring could potentially identify and prevent violent incidents, but they are often used for commercial or political purposes rather than public protection. Privacy concerns about surveillance technology are legitimate and important, but the current approach of essentially prohibiting effective use of technology for public safety while allowing unlimited use for commercial and political purposes serves neither privacy nor safety interests. A more balanced approach could use technology to prevent violence while protecting legitimate privacy interests. Artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies could potentially identify patterns and warning signs that human analysts might miss, but these technologies are currently used more for commercial applications than for public safety. The same algorithms that can predict consumer behavior and target advertising could potentially predict and prevent violent incidents, but this application has received minimal investment compared to commercial uses. The international comparison reveals how far American public safety has deteriorated compared to other developed countries. Nations with lower rates of violence often have more effective integration between law enforcement agencies, better mental health treatment systems, more comprehensive social support programs, and political cultures that prioritize public safety over ideological purity. But simply importing policies from other countries won't solve our problems because our violence crisis is deeply rooted in specific American conditions, including our political polarization, our economic inequality, our cultural attitudes toward violence, and our institutional failures. Solutions must address these underlying American conditions rather than just copying approaches that work in different contexts. The constitutional framework within which we must operate creates both opportunities and constraints for addressing violence. The Second Amendment protects individual rights to bear arms, but it doesn't prevent reasonable regulations that could reduce gun violence without infringing on legitimate rights. The First Amendment protects free speech, but it doesn't protect direct incitement to violence or true threats against specific individuals. The balance between individual rights and public safety is difficult to maintain, but our current approach has tilted too far toward protecting individual rights while ignoring public safety responsibilities. A more balanced approach could protect both constitutional rights and public safety through carefully crafted policies that address specific problems without creating unnecessary restrictions on legitimate activities. The federal system of government creates coordination challenges for addressing violence that crosses state lines or involves multiple jurisdictions, but it also provides opportunities for innovation and experimentation at state and local levels. States and localities that have implemented effective violence prevention programs could serve as models for broader adoption if federal policy supported rather than hindered these efforts. But federal policies often work against effective local initiatives through unfunded mandates, regulatory constraints, and funding formulas that reward compliance with federal priorities rather than effective results. A more effective federal approach would support local innovation while providing coordination and resources for addressing violence that crosses jurisdictional boundaries. The path forward requires acknowledging that our current approach to violence prevention has failed and committing to fundamental changes in how we think about and address public safety. This means moving beyond partisan talking points and ideological commitments to focus on evidence-based policies that actually reduce violence and protect citizens. It means investing in effective law enforcement that prevents violence rather than simply responding to it after it occurs. It means creating mental health and social support systems that identify and help potentially violent individuals before they harm others. It means regulating technology platforms that currently profit from promoting violence while contributing nothing to public safety. Most importantly, it means holding political leaders accountable for the policy failures that have created our current violence crisis. Politicians who prioritize ideological purity over public safety, who refuse to acknowledge policy failures, or who use violence for political advantage should be replaced by leaders who understand that government's primary responsibility is protecting citizens from harm. The American people deserve better than the violence and fear that have become routine parts of daily life. We deserve political leaders who take public safety seriously, law enforcement agencies that prevent violence rather than just investigating it, and social institutions that address the underlying causes of violence rather than just managing its consequences. Charlie Kirk's assassination and Irina Zarutska's murder were preventable tragedies that occurred because our institutions failed to do their jobs, but they don't have to be repeated. We can build safer communities, more effective institutions, and a political culture that prioritizes protecting citizens over scoring political points. The question is whether we have the courage to acknowledge our failures and make the changes necessary to prevent future tragedies. Because until we do, more Charlie Kirks and more Irina Zarutskas will die, while politicians offer thoughts and prayers instead of real solutions. The disturbing reality behind America's violence and safety breakdown is that it's not inevitable, it's not unchangeable, and it's not beyond our capacity to fix. But fixing it requires admitting that our current approach has failed and committing to fundamental changes in how we approach public safety. That's why I'm speaking out about these issues, even though it's politically risky and personally difficult. Someone has to tell the truth about what's happening to our country and what it will take to make it safe again. Someone has to connect the dots between individual tragedies and systematic failures. Someone has to demand that our institutions start doing their jobs and protecting the people they're supposed to serve. The violence crisis in America is real, it's getting worse, and it's affecting every community and every family. But it's not unstoppable. With the right policies, the right priorities, and the right leadership, we can rebuild the safe society that Americans deserve. The question is whether we'll choose to do the hard work required or continue accepting violence as the new normal.